Well, hello again. Welcome to part four, the last module in critical thinking in the classroom. Once again, we're going to continue our discussion of the different tools and strategies that you might incorporate into your classroom as a teacher to facilitate higher order critical thinking skills. So our last piece, we're going to focus on argumentative or argumentation, right? So oftentimes we are wanting our students to make an argument. Arguments are prevalent in philosophical based kinds of courses, scientific, social science kinds of courses, right, where we're wanting students to make a case to support a conclusion in certain ways. One of the things that I want to sort of talk about and maybe kind of throw in, because we haven't really talked much about metacognitive principles, and I thought this might be a good place to do so, and that is that, right, anytime you are trying to make an argument, you are essentially trying to persuade your audience of something. And I think this is also a good place to sort of think about the fact that there's some metacognitive principles that speak to the question of who's persuadable, how do you persuade people. In the field of psychology, within social psychology in particular, there are a number of models and theories that one might leverage anytime someone is attempting to persuade someone. So I thought it might sort of gain honorable mention here. So for example, cognitive dissonance. A theory that basically argues that anytime we have two ideas that are in conflict with each other, that creates a kind of dissonance or a kind of uncomfortable feeling, and we are therefore motivated to restore balance to those thoughts. Well, as it turns out, cognitive dissonance can be a very important mechanism for attitude change, right? Oftentimes, if people engage in behaviors that's counter-attitudinal, in other words, those behaviors are counter to their attitudes, people will oftentimes adjust their attitudes likewise. So in that case, behavior can in fact be a way of actually persuading people. Also within social psychology, there's a theory called the elaboration likelihood model that talks about the fact that there are essentially two routes to which people might be persuaded. A central route, which reflects more careful, overt, very cerebral kinds of processing, versus more peripheral processing, which tends to be more implicit. It tends to not so much focus on, say, the strength of arguments as well as much as things that we would consider peripheral, like humor or who the author is, and the like. The final things is that, so within that literature in social psychology, there is principles that are around issues around conformity, compliance, and obedience, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of literature that speaks to principles that guide each of these phenomena. And once again, all of these things would be things that would be relevant to argumentation. And so to the degree to which one is aware of these various models, theories, and principles, right, that might also be something that could be leveraged in making an argument. Okay, so not your typical standard things that are covered in a critical thinking module, but I thought they would be important to mention because I do think they answer to the question of what might be some metacognitive principles here. But one of the most popular tools, right, for dealing with argumentative, once again, whether you are simply attempting to process argumentative information or you are trying to make an argument, would be something simply called argument analysis. And the basics of an argument analysis is that arguments consist of at least two essential components. One, a conclusion, and then two, a premise, right? So in order for there to be an argument, there must be at least these two things, a conclusion and a premise. And what's important is that a conclusion without a premise is not a conclusion, it's an assertion, right? So one of the things, and premises may be either logic or they may be evidence, but those are the two core components of an argument. Arguments may include, they're not necessary in order for there to be an argument, but a good argument, one might argue, might also include what are called qualifiers, right? Qualifiers sort of give us the boundaries of when a conclusion might be true, right? So the conclusion that one draws from a premise might not be true under certain circumstances. So it might be important to qualify the conclusion, or for that matter, even the premise. Arguments might also include what's called a counter argument, right? So in that sense, there may be a counter conclusion and premise, normally for the purpose of attempting to maybe suggest that that counter argument is not valid. And so in that sense, it may be included as an attempt to really kind of knock it down. So a basic tool, right, is an argument analysis. Once again, this might be a tool that you're already familiar with, and so therefore you might already have stuff on it. So what I want to do is actually focus on I would call it a bit of an elaboration on an argument analysis, although I will also make the argument that I could have just as easily presented this next tool under the expository category, because I think it's also a great way to do expository, but I decided to include it here because I think it's a way to kind of grow an argument analysis. And that's something called the 8 elements of reasoning. This is a technique developed by philosopher Richard Paul and psychologist Linda Elder. And so there's lots of materials out there, lots of books for sale that one could get access to that would take you through this in a tremendous amount of depth. Just for brevity's sake, I've included a handout that comes from some of the material that they've actually made available for free that kind of gives you a little bit more elaboration than perhaps what I'm going to provide as I walk you through these 8 elements. So their argument is that any reasoning, and for that matter, any argument, consists of basically 8 elements. And so if you're going to understand the argument, if you're going to understand the reasoning, you must be able to identify these 8 elements. And for that matter, if you're going to make an argument, right, you need to make a case, or you need to make sure that you are hopefully explicit about these 8 elements. So what are they? The first one would be the purpose, right? So why is the if we say an article or a book, why is it being written? Why is the argument being made? The second one has to do with a point of view. So what is the point of view of the author? Oftentimes this requires being able to kind of understand a little bit about the background of the author, because it may be a disciplinary point of view. It might be a theoretical point of view. So an argument might be argued from a given theory or a given scientific paradigm. So what is that point of view? The third piece of this are, what are the main concepts? What are the main concepts? You might think of these as, what are the things that need to be defined, right, to make sure that we understand what they are. The fourth thing is, so what's the main point? What's the main problem? Sometimes people refer to this as the thesis, right? What's the main thesis of the paper? Owing back to argument analysis, we might also think of this as, what's the main conclusion that the authors are trying to draw. The fifth thing is that, what are the inferences, right? Inferences is another word for hypotheses. So if it's a scientific article, right, then this would speak very much to what the hypotheses are. But even in non-scientific writing, right, there's some point that people are trying to argue, right? You might also think of the inferences as the premises, right, from the argument analysis. And then what evidence might be offered to support those inferences, or for that matter, the main point. And once again, this evidence may be more logically oriented, or it may in fact be more empirically based upon data. And then next thing is, what are the assumptions, right? What assumptions are being made as you sort of think about the links that exist between, say, the evidence to the inferences, from the inferences to the main point, right? In between each of those links are some assumptions, right? Assumptions about what constitutes valid evidence to support an inference, for example, or an assumption about the connection between an inference to a main point. And so the question is, once again, what's being assumed by the author? And then the eighth element are the implications, right? What are the implications? Think of this as sort of connected to that so what question, or the mean that we talked about in the expository module. So what? Okay, so if the main point is true and the inferences are true, then what might be the implications that one might draw from this particular work? So according to Paul and Elder, right, this kind of technique or tool can be really applied to any unit of analysis of reasoning, including things like articles, chapters, books, entire fields of study. And so one of the things that they've done is they've painstakingly in many of their books actually have taken through and have actually defined, for example, entire disciplines, psychology and philosophy, mathematics and biology, from these 8 elements, really just to kind of prove their point that virtually anything can be analyzed using these 8 elements of reasoning. And so I think other important areas of application are class discussions. Oftentimes when a discussion is being held about something, I will oftentimes ask my students to think through these 8 things, right? What do you think is the purpose here? What do you suppose are some of the main inferences? What are some of the main constructs here, right? And all the way down to the implications. What the so what about this? Article and book critiques, right? Oftentimes, to the degree to which one accepts Paul and Elder's model as Bible, right? One might think of this as an interesting technique by which to critique articles and books, right? To the degree to which they answer those 8 questions. And of course, for the purposes we're talking about here, argumentative essays, right? The idea here is that a good argumentative essay is going to address all 8 of these elements. And for someone who is attempting to write on a argumentative essay, then using this as a way of outlining. So for example, one of the things I've had my students do is to actually take these 8 elements of reasoning and just use it to kind of outline an argument. Which brings us to your final assignment for this module, and that is I would like you to take the 8 elements of reasoning and to use it as an outline. And once again, you have 2 choices. You can either use it as an outline for, say, something that you're attempting to argue. And once again, keep in mind, it's also kind of a nice little expository technique, so it's perfectly fine if you want to use it more in that mode as well. And so once again, if you are thinking about writing something, you are free to take this as a way to outline what you intend to write and see how well it fits there. The other way is, once again, apply it to some text that you are reading, whether it be an article or a book chapter or an entire book or what have you. You might actually use it that way. In other words, see if you can't go through and identify what do you consider to be the purpose, the point of view, the main constructs, evidence, implications of what you're reading. So you will find inside of the module a template that you can use, once again, to either use it as a way to generate your own outline for something you'd like to write, or to use it as a way of actually analyzing a given text. Once you have completed that, please upload that to the assignment for the 3rd module. Thank you.